The Atlantic was more than a vast stretch of water. It was the lifeline of freedom. Every ship that crossed it carried weapons, food, fuel, and hope for Britain's survival. Without it, the island nation would starve, its war machine grind to a halt. Yet beneath the waves lurked an invisible predator, the German U-boat. Silent, deadly, and waiting in the cold depths, they threatened to sever the artery that kept Britain alive. It wasn't just a battle for supplies, it was a battle for the very possibility of winning the war. Imagine standing on the deck of a merchant ship in 1940. The sea is calm, but every ripple feels like a warning. Somewhere in the darkness, a periscope might be watching you. Adolf Hitler believed his submarines could strangle Britain into submission, forcing it out of the war. German Admiral Karl Dönitz unleashed his Wolfpack's groups of U-boats, coordinated to attack convoys en masse. Their mission was simple: sink as much tonnage as possible, faster than the Allies could replace it. At first it worked with terrifying success. In the opening years, U-boats were unstoppable. Between 1939 and 1941, merchant ships went down almost daily. The ocean floor became a graveyard of steel and sailors. Germany celebrated what it called the happy time, when U-boat crews struck with near impunity. For Britain, each sunken ship was more than a statistic hit, was a lifeline cut. Families back home waited for letters that would never come, while harbors filled with widows searching for answers. The Royal Navy struggled to protect the convoys, but the hunters always seemed one step ahead. But how did the U-boats achieve such deadly precision? The answer was strategy. Dönitz designed his Wolfpack tactics to overwhelm convoy escorts. At night, on the surface, U-boats looked like shadows. They would approach silently, fire torpedoes, and vanish into the dark sea. One explosion could ignite fuel tanks, setting the ocean ablaze. Survivors clung to debris as cries echoed across the waves. Each attack was not just destruction, it was psychological warfare. Sailors lived with constant dread, never knowing when the next torpedo would strike. Fear itself became a weapon. Some stories are almost unbearable. In September 1940, the passenger liner SS City of Benares was torpedoed in the North Atlantic. On board were over 400 people, including nearly 100 children being evacuated from Britain. The strike killed many instantly, and freezing waters claimed dozens more. The tragedy shocked the world and sparked outrage. Hitler's gamble wasn't just military, it was moral. Could Germany's brutal U-boat war turn neutral nations like the United States against them? That question began to hang heavily over the Atlantic, a storm brewing on the horizon. As the war expanded, so too did the stakes. Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill later admitted, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." It wasn't hyperbole. Without supplies, Britain would collapse. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't a side story, it was the war's longest and most decisive campaign. German submarines prowled from the Arctic Circle to the Caribbean, leaving oil slicks and twisted wreckage in their wake. Every convoy became a roll of the dice, every voyage a test of endurance. But Britain wasn't fighting alone. Across the ocean, American neutrality grew thinner by the day. German submarines even prowled the U.S. East Coast, sinking ships within sight of coastal towns. In early 1942, flames lit up the night sky off New Jersey and Virginia. The war felt uncomfortably close for Americans who had believed it distant. President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced mounting pressure. How long could the United States remain on the sidelines while its own waters burned? The U-boats were not just hunting ships. They were dragging America into the war. Technology became a battlefield of its own. The Allies scrambled to find new ways to counter the unseen menace. Radar sonar, known as ASCII depth charges, and code breaking would all play their roles. Yet in 1941, before the full force of American industry was felt, the Allies were stretched thin. Escort ships were too few, aircraft coverage limited, and losses staggering. It seemed that for every U-boat sunk, 3 merchantmen went down. Could science and industry outpace the ruthless efficiency of Dönitz's Wolfpacks? The race between hunter and hunted had only just begun. Still, there were flashes of hope. In May 1941, the British captured U-110 after a daring surface battle. On board, they found something invaluable: an Enigma machine, the very device used to encode German communications. The discovery was a breakthrough, allowing codebreakers at Bletchley Park to begin unraveling the secrets of U-boat movements. Yet the work was dangerous and uncertain. One missed signal could mean dozens of ships lost. The Allies now had a weapon of intelligence, but could they wield it in time to save the convoys? For U-boat crews, life was hardly glamorous. Cramped in steel tubes, they endured foul air, crushing depth, and the constant threat of death. Every dive pressed the hull to its limits. Every explosion shook the crew to the core. Some sailors cracked under the strain, the others clung to camaraderie in the suffocating dark. German propaganda portrayed them as knights of the sea, but in reality, they were young men trapped in a deadly lottery. Each patrol could be their last. The Atlantic swallowed many without leaving a trace. For merchant sailors, survival was no easier. Convoy duty meant weeks of tension, always scanning the horizon for danger. When torpedoes struck, chaos followed. Explosions ripped through steel hulls, cargo burned, and men leapt into icy waters. Rescue was uncertain. Many froze before help arrived. These sailors, often civilians, paid the highest price in a battle few outside the sea ever witnessed. Their courage kept nations alive, yet their sacrifice went largely unsung. Could the public truly grasp the scale of their ordeal, or would history overlook them? In 1942, the U-boats reached their peak. Allied losses mounted to over 7 million tons of shipping in a single year. It was a catastrophe. Entire convoys vanished, their positions betrayed by coded messages the Allies had yet to fully crack. Churchill feared the tipping point had come. Britain's ports ran dry, the war would end, not with invasion, but with starvation. The world held its breath. Could the Allies withstand this storm, or was Germany about to win the war beneath the waves? The answer was still uncertain, but cracks were forming in the German onslaught. The vastness of the ocean, once an advantage, began to turn against them. Allied aircraft, once scarce, now prowled from Greenland to West Africa. The creation of escort carriers, small aircraft carriers dedicated to convoy protection, changed the equation. Suddenly, submarines once safe on the surface were hunted from above. Depth charges rained down, forcing U-boats to dive deeper and stay longer underwater. What had once been an ocean of opportunity was slowly becoming a killing ground for the hunters themselves. The tide was turning, but not without sacrifice. Allied sailors fought running battles across endless nights, their ships lit by burning oil. Survivors clung to life rafts, whispering prayers as destroyers darted between them. U-boats were still dangerous, but no longer untouchable. German losses mounted as more submarines failed to return from patrol. In the cramped offices of Bletchley Park, codebreakers cheered each breakthrough, knowing it might save hundreds of lives. Yet the question lingered. Had the Allies turned the corner for good, or was another deadly storm on the way? By late 1943, hope surged. Convoy losses dropped dramatically while U-boat casualties soared. The hunters were becoming the hunted. Churchill declared victory in the Battle of the Atlantic, though fighting would continue until war's end. For the men at sea, relief came slowly, haunted by memories of ships lost and comrades gone forever. But as the Allies secured the Atlantic lifeline, a new possibility opened the invasion of Europe itself. The road to day began here, on the cold, unforgiving waters of the Atlantic. Victory at sea never came cheaply. Even as the Allies celebrated turning the tide, sailors still faced death daily. Convoys stretched like floating cities, vulnerable from every angle. Escorts weaved desperately, listening for the faint ping of sonar that might reveal a lurking submarine. But for every U-boat destroyed, others slipped through. A single torpedo could undo weeks of careful planning. The ocean was vast, and war in the deep was never truly won. It was endured. Behind the headlines, the toll on U-boat crews was staggering. By war's end, nearly 75% of German submariners would never return home, the highest casualty rate of any branch of service. Young men who had once marched proudly through Hamburg or Bremen simply vanished beneath the waves. Families waited for news that never arrived. For Admiral Dönitz, every sinking of enemy tonnage carried the shadow of his own men lost. The hunters had become martyrs of a war they were increasingly doomed to lose. But the Allies did not fight on the sea alone. They fought in the realm of intelligence. At Bletchley Park, Alan Turing and his team refined their code-breaking efforts, turning the secrets of the Enigma machine into weapons of survival. Convoy routes adjusted in silence, unseen by the enemy. German messages, once unbreakable, now betrayed the hunters' lairs. It was a war of numbers and signals fought by minds as sharp as steel. Yet secrecy was vital if, the Germans suspected, the advantage could vanish overnight. The psychological battle was just as fierce. Merchant sailors dreaded the isolation of the mid-Atlantic gap, an area beyond the reach of air cover. Here, ships vanished without warning, swallowed by torpedoes in the night. Survivors described the terror of floating for days in lifeboats, watching flames flicker on the horizon where their convoy had been. Each voyage demanded courage beyond imagination. To cross the Atlantic was not simply to sail it, was to gamble with death again and again. Yet out of this crucible came stories of astonishing heroism. Convoy escorts often charged directly into torpedo spreads, sacrificing themselves to save others. Depth charge attacks shook the sea as destroyers hunted shadows. Pilots flying from makeshift carriers braved storms and freezing spray to strike submarines surfacing for air. Ordinary men became legends in these forgotten duels. Their bravery bought precious time, allowing supplies to reach Britain and soldiers to reach the front. The battle for the Atlantic was not won by strategy alone, it was won by endurance. Germany, too, sought innovation. New U-boat designs promised greater range and stealth. The Type 21, a so-called wonder submarine, could remain submerged for days, powered by advanced batteries. If deployed earlier, it might have changed the war. But time was not on Hitler's side. By 1944, Allied bombers hammered shipyards before new submarines could sail. Germany's technological edge came too late, crushed beneath the weight of Allied industry and air power. The ocean that once seemed theirs was slipping away. Still, the Atlantic demanded sacrifice to the very end. Even in 1945, as Berlin crumbled, U-boats prowled the waters. Convoys were still struck, sailors still lost. The war beneath the waves refused to end quietly. In fact, the last Allied ship sunk in the Atlantic was torpedoed just hours before Germany's surrender. For those who fought there, the sea held no mercy. Peace would come to Europe, but beneath the surface lay a cemetery of iron and bone, silent reminders of a relentless struggle. What did it feel like to live in that struggle? Survivors often spoke of the silence. In the moments after a torpedo hit, when flames roared and steel screamed, there came a hush broken only by the sea. Men drifting in lifeboats listened to the waves slap against charred wreckage, waiting for rescue that might never come. Each dawn brought both relief and despair, the promise of survival, or the confirmation of abandonment. The Atlantic had a way of stripping men down to their most fragile humanity. The numbers alone are staggering. Over 36,000 sailors from the Merchant Navy perished during the Battle of the Atlantic. The Royal Navy lost nearly 30,000. Germany's U-boat arm lost more than 28,000. Each number hides a life, a family, a story cut short. Behind every statistic lies a kitchen table left empty, a letter never answered, a generation scarred by the silence of absence. The Atlantic did not discriminate whether German submariner or British seaman. Its toll was merciless. But numbers can never capture the full legacy. Sailors spoke of nightmares long after the guns fell silent. Many could not bear the sound of waves against a ship's hull. Some turned to drink, others to silence. Trauma lingered in unspoken ways. Families noticed men staring into the distance, haunted by flashes of burning oil and sinking ships. These wounds were invisible yet enduring. The Atlantic had claimed not just bodies but souls, leaving scars across generations. And yet there was pride. For Britain's survival was victory enough. The convoys had delivered. Food reached hungry mouths, weapons armed the soldiers of D-Day, fuel kept the bombers flying. Without the Atlantic lifeline, liberation would have been impossible. Sailors who endured its terror knew, deep down, that they had held the line against tyranny. Their struggle, though hidden beneath the glamour of great land battles, was no less decisive. History itself had turned upon the waves. In the United States, the battle reshaped the nation's role in the world. Shipyards worked day and night, producing Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. American destroyers and aircraft transformed the balance. The ocean that once seemed to belong to Germany became a highway of American resolve. The war beneath the waves forged the transatlantic bond, uniting Britain and America not only in arms, but in destiny. Together, they proved that even in the darkest seas, unity could overcome fear. And what of Germany? For the U-boat crews, glory turned to despair. Once hailed as knights of the sea, they became expendable weapons in a losing war. Many went down knowing their chances of survival were slim. Some commanders even chose scuttling over surrender, sinking their vessels rather than giving them up. By war's end, harbors in Germany were filled not with proud returns but with empty berths. Dönitz himself, who rose to become Hitler's successor, could only watch his U-boat fleet drown in defeat. The end of the Atlantic War left behind wrecks littering the seabed's silent tombs where thousands rest. To this day, the ocean keeps their secrets. Divers speak of eerie stillness, of twisted steel cloaked in sand, of artifacts frozen in time. The sea remembers even when people forget. The Battle of the Atlantic was not just fought in charts and tunage, was written in lives forever sealed beneath the waves. History's greatest naval struggle still lies hidden, echoing through the deep. And yet, the story does not end here. For the Atlantic War was not only a tale of loss and endurance, it was a prelude to liberation. The survival of the convoys made possible the invasion of Europe, the breaking of Hitler's fortress, and the dawn of a new world order. The sea had been both battlefield and savior. The tide had turned, but the echoes of that struggle would ripple far beyond 1945, and in the next chapter, those echoes would shape the fate of continents. By 1943, the Atlantic began to feel like a different battlefield. Convoys that once sailed in terror now moved with growing confidence, shielded by aircraft and destroyers. The hunters were no longer invisible. Radar pierced the night, and depth charges thundered with deadly accuracy. German commanders knew the tide had shifted. What was once their playground had become their graveyard. But in war, nothing ends cleanly. Each U-boat sunk meant dozens of lives lost, young men who had once believed in victory, now swallowed by an unforgiving sea. The psychological toll was immense. Sailors spoke of the thousand-yard stare, eyes fixed on nothing, haunted by what they had seen. For survivors, every wave seemed to carry the memory of past explosions. Merchant seamen, often overlooked, endured as much trauma as soldiers in the trenches. They weren't trained warriors, but civilians thrust into a war where the enemy was unseen. Many returned home to no parades, no medals, only silence. Their sacrifice was invisible to the world, but essential to victory. Families back home lived a different kind of battle. Mothers and wives opened telegrams with trembling hands, fearing the words no one wanted to read, missing, presumed lost at sea. Children grew up without fathers, their memories defined by absence. The Battle of the Atlantic stretched not just across oceans, but into kitchens and living rooms across Britain, Canada, and America. It was a war that seeped into daily life, its shadow felt in every loaf of bread, every rationed meal, every anxious glance at the postman. In Germany, the mood shifted as well. The early cheers for U-boat victories gave way to quiet dread. Towns once filled with parades for returning crews became towns of widows. Admiral Dönitz pushed his men harder, desperate to break the blockade strangling Germany. But Allied air raids devastated shipyards, fuel supplies dwindled, and morale cracked. The U-boat, once a symbol of German might, became a symbol of tragic sacrifice. Every patrol was more dangerous than the last, and few crews survived to tell their stories. Technology turned the tide with relentless momentum. Long-range Liberator bombers closed the deadly mid-Atlantic gap. Once the graveyard of convoys, escort carriers brought air power directly to the convoys, forcing submarines to dive before they could strike. High-frequency direction, finding known as Huff Duff, pinpointed U-boat radio signals. It was a chess game played across thousands of miles, and slowly the Allies cornered their opponent. The wolf packs that once hunted in silence were now the prey, stalked from sea and sky alike. Still, every victory came with blood. Survivors described the ocean itself as the true enemy, merciless, endless, and cold. Sailors froze on open decks as Atlantic storms lashed with hurricane force. Waves the size of buildings crashed over ships, tearing men from ropes and sweeping them into darkness. Those who endured it called the sea the great equalizer. Torpedoes and depth charges could kill, but so could the elements. In the Atlantic, survival meant conquering both man and nature. The human cost carved deep scars. Some sailors confessed that the smell of diesel and salt water decades later still triggered memories of burning ships. Nightmares replayed the screams of comrades, the blinding flash of explosions. Psychologists of the time had no name for it, but today we know it as trauma. In the silence after the war, many veterans carried it alone. Their war did not end with peace, it lived on, whispered in restless dreams and silent stares at the horizon. Yet without their endurance, history would have turned differently. The convoys brought not only survival, but victory. They carried American troops by the hundreds of thousands across the ocean, building the armies that would storm the beaches of Normandy. They delivered tanks, jeeps, aircraft, and fuel every tool of liberation. The Atlantic was the road to today. Without it, there would have been no invasion, no liberation of France, no breaking of Hitler's grip on Europe. The fate of nations sailed on merchant hulls. D-Day itself was born of Atlantic struggle. In June 1944, the largest armada in history crossed the Channel, shielded by lessons learned in the battle against U-boats. The invasion succeeded not because the Allies were lucky, but because the Atlantic lifeline had held firm. Soldiers who stormed Normandy's beaches owed their chance to the countless sailors who had braved the Atlantic before them. Every rifle fired that day, every tank that rolled ashore, had once crossed waters once haunted by submarines. But as the Allies surged forward, the U-boats fought on. Some struck even during D-Day, torpedoing ships near the invasion fleet. Others hunted supply lines feeding the breakout into France. Their persistence was remarkable, but it was also futile. The war machine of the Allies was now unstoppable, fueled by the lifeline they had secured. Germany's submarines had gone from hunters to desperate defenders, clinging to relevance in a war already lost. Their defiance could not alter the tide of history. Still, the ocean showed no mercy. Even in 1945, ships vanished beneath torpedoes. Sailors perished just days before peace was declared. The Atlantic War refused to end cleanly. For the men who lived it, there was no single moment of triumph, only exhaustion, relief, and mourning. Victory was not celebrated with cheers, but with silence. Silence for those who never returned. Silence for the thousands still entombed beneath the waves. Silence for the ghosts that the ocean would keep forever. When peace finally came, the Atlantic breathed again. Convoys returned without fear, ports bustled with life, and the endless tension of listening for periscopes faded into memory. But for many, the war beneath the waves never truly ended. Empty chairs at dinner tables, names etched on memorials, and the quiet grief of survivors kept the story alive. Victory in Europe was not only a triumph, it was a reminder of the staggering cost of endurance. The Atlantic had demanded everything, and it had taken much. Generations later, the echoes still resound. Maritime memorials across Britain, Canada, and America honor the sailors with no graves but the sea. Wreaths float on waters once blackened by oil and fire. Families who never saw their loved ones buried find solace in remembrance. The Atlantic remains vast and indifferent, but in its depths lie stories of human courage and suffering that refuse to be forgotten. The waves carry whispers of men who gave everything so that freedom might survive. In Germany, 2 memorials stand for the U-boat crews. Once celebrated, later mourned, they remain a symbol of tragic sacrifice. Young men convinced of glory were instead delivered into silence. Their families grieved in the same way as their enemies. War, beneath the surface, blurred the lines of nationality. The Atlantic took without prejudice. It held German and British sailors alike, equal in their suffering, equal in their anonymity. Death in the deep cared nothing for flags. The Battle of the Atlantic was more than a struggle for supply. It was a test of endurance, of will, of humanity itself. It shaped the outcome of the Second World War, but it also reshaped those who fought it. Sailors carried its weight for a lifetime, and nations built their post-war futures upon its legacy. Yet the ocean remains silent, a keeper of secrets. As we look back, the question lingers: what does the sea remember that we have forgotten? The answer lies in the final chapters. The final blow came not from the sea, but from the air. By 1944, long-range bombers, like the B-24 Liberator, hunted U-boats across the Atlantic. Radar-equipped aircraft could spot them on the surface before they had time to dive. Depth charges fell with deadly precision, turning the once feared wolf packs into hunted prey. Each attack chipped away at Germany's ability to disrupt Allied shipping, bringing the endgame ever closer. But U-boat crews did not surrender quietly. Some captains still scored victories, sending Allied freighters to the bottom, even as the tide turned against them. For young sailors on both sides, the war had become a cycle of fear and retaliation. Survivors described the sea itself as their enemy, cold, unforgiving, and filled with ghosts. The final phase of the Battle of the Atlantic was not a swift collapse, but a slow grind into inevitability. Hitler's gamble had failed. U-boat arm, once his trump card, was bleeding out. By May 1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz himself admitted heavy losses had crippled their campaign. His promise that U-boats would starve Britain into submission now rang hollow. Germany could no longer stop the flood of American troops and supplies pouring into Europe. The path to D-Day and the liberation of Western Europe lay open. Yet the price of victory was staggering. Over 36,000 merchant sailors from Britain, the United States, and other Allied nations died in the Atlantic. Civilian crews, often forgotten in war stories, bore the brunt of the danger. They sailed unarmed ships through seas, crawling with U-boats, carrying food and weapons essential for survival. Their sacrifice ensured Britain never starved, and America's arsenal reached the front lines. On the German side, the toll was equally grim. Nearly 30,000 U-boat sailors were lost, 3 out of every 4 who served. Few military branches in history have endured such catastrophic casualty rates. For many of these young men, their steel submarines became coffins sealed beneath the ocean. Letters to families went unanswered, their last resting place, an unmarked grave in the deep. The Atlantic became a vast cemetery. Thousands of wrecks, from merchant freighters to U-boats, still lie scattered across the seabed. Divers and sonar scans today reveal twisted metal, silent reminders of a war once fought with ruthless intensity. Each wreck tells a story of bravery, terror, and loss. The ocean has kept these secrets for decades, but the echoes of that struggle remain. The psychological scars endured long after the war ended. Survivors spoke of nightmares, the sudden roar of torpedoes, the screams in the water, the desperate fight for survival. Many merchant sailors returned home to little recognition, their courage overshadowed by soldiers and generals. Yet without them, victory would have been impossible. The Battle of the Atlantic was as much a test of human endurance as of weapons and machines. The lessons of the U-boat war shaped the Cold War to come. NATO navies studied submarine tactics, building sonar networks, and anti-submarine weapons. The struggle between hunter and hunted beneath the waves continued, now with nuclear stakes. Every sonar ping and shadow under the water carried echoes of the Atlantic War, a reminder of how close the world had once come to collapse. For Britain, the Atlantic was more than just a battlefield. It was a lifeline. Churchill later wrote that the Battle of the Atlantic was the dominating factor throughout the war. Without victory at sea, there could be no D-Day, no liberation of Europe, no final defeat of Nazi Germany. It was a war of attrition, fought mile by mile, ship by ship, convoy by convoy. For the United States, it was the first true test of global power. America's industrial might, combined with Britain's resilience, turned the tide. Liberty ships rolled off assembly lines faster than U-boats could sink them. Radar, sonar, and code breaking became decisive weapons. The Battle of the Atlantic revealed not just the brutality of modern war, but also the potential of innovation and unity. The war beneath the waves was both invisible and all-consuming. Unlike the beaches of Normandy or the ruins of Berlin, it left no monuments for crowds to see. Its legacy was silence, the hum of a ship engine, the creak of steel under pressure, the endless horizon of an unforgiving ocean. Yet within that silence, history was decided. The courage of those who fought there must not be forgotten. Merchant sailors, escort crews, and even the U-boat men themselves endured horrors few on land could imagine. Their war was fought in shadows and storms, with death always a heartbeat away. To understand World War II fully, we must listen to the voices from beneath the waves. The ocean still whispers their stories. From the icy depths off Greenland to the warmer waters of the Caribbean, the Battle of the Atlantic stretched across half the globe. It was not one battle, but thousands, fought in silence, in darkness, in terror, and in hope. In the end, It was a battle not just for territory, but for survival. A fight to keep supply lines open, to keep nations alive, to keep freedom's flame burning against the storm. Victory in the Atlantic ensured victory in Europe. Without it, the world we know today might never have existed. And so, the waves close over the past, but the memory remains. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest, most brutal struggle of World War II, a war of nerves and endurance fought beneath the surface. If these stories moved you, honor the memory of those who fought by keeping their history alive. Like, share, and subscribe to ensure their voices are never lost beneath the waves.